Hi, my name is Aaron Cockerill, and I'm going to be talking today about security from endpoint to cloud. Really, the need to secure from the endpoint to the cloud in this new environment where the majority of our employees are working from home. So in this new environment, we find out CISO customers faced with the challenge of securing their corporate data in this new environment where the data could be being connected to or resident on home computers, traveling over networks they don't manage, and going to ultimately wherever the employee needs that data in order to perform their job, their role. The other challenge that CISOs are facing at the moment is the complying with regulations in that scenario. It was far easier to adhere to regulations that, for example, dictate encryption of content in transit and rest and those types of things, as well as many other regulations, when all of the devices were inside the corporate perimeter and under your management. When that disappears, complying with the regulations becomes very difficult. And then lastly, as I mentioned, respecting user privacy in this new mix. So that, I think, is the challenges that we understand our CISO, our partners and customers to be facing. What I'd like to talk to you now about is what we believe is the right approach to solving these problems. So to do that, I've created a little bit more of a diagrammatic representation of what corporations have been like and have transitioned to, and how this solution can work for you. So if we look at it more a traditional organization, this representation is a firewall encircling all of the users and all of the on-premise applications. And so maybe we're going back a little bit too far in time, but this type of environment, I think, is where most of the IT organizations that I come in contact with, was the end state that they were most comfortable with, but it has started to change, which is limiting their control. And let's go through how that's changed. Well, firstly, I'll describe the environment. So they have comprehensive configuration management for all of the endpoints as well as the applications. Global access controls through things like Active Directory policies and so on that make it really consistent across that entire domain. They had data loss prevention typically deployed in that perimeter to ensure that any sensitive data or data of particular particular types of data was not able to traverse that perimeter inappropriately. Intrusion prevention or intrusion detection and so on, intrusion detection to stop inbound connections coming into either the endpoints or the servers that were not appropriate, malware protection across all of the devices and in the perimeter, content filtering to filter that inappropriate content when accessing the internet and so on. And even things like email filtering to stop spam and malicious emails and phishing to some extent as well. So this was a homogeneous environment in which the IT department felt that they had complete control in most cases. Now, that might be overly generalized, but I think that that's the history from which most of us have come. And of course, I said it started changing. One of the most obvious first changes was remote users. And so remote users, we traditionally enabled using VPNs, and the establishment of that VPN connection typically encompassed some sort of network access control. So the device can't connect to the corporate infrastructure unless it's got antivirus or something like that, and is of a particular configuration, or maybe even has a certificate deployed and so on. What's happened in the recent history is then we started adopting the cloud. So it was primarily first with applications in the cloud, SaaS applications like the examples that I'm showing here, and increasingly then infrastructure as a service as well. But most companies that I talk to, or organizations that I talk to, were in the transition between a considerable on-prem infrastructure and moving to the cloud. I think that most companies would define that they were in the process of some form of digital transformation. And then the pandemic hit, and like I said earlier, they ultimately started deploying VPNs to solve that problem. So in this scenario, typically the employees that were gaining access using the VPN were hairpinning the traffic back out to these cloud services, or connecting directly to these cloud services with the access control typically implemented by some form of identity and access management capability. And they're frequently hairpinning traffic generally to the internet, which has those same performance challenges that I talked about earlier, as well as the security challenges. And in this world now, if you look at the previous capabilities that you had as an IT organization, you've lost configuration management to some extent now, not of the endpoints at this point, but definitely across the server infrastructure, the way that you specified configuration for how your SaaS applications and infrastructure as a service might be deployed and managed. As well as you've lost the global access control policies that you had when everything was inside the perimeter and managed through a domain. Obviously, access controls associated with the specific features of a SaaS application are managed completely separately and individually to each one of those SaaS applications. So you've lost that global level of access control. And as I said, this is typically the situation that we find ourselves in right now, with over-provisioned VPNs and having to try and work with the scenario that each one of these VPN connections is really a connection like a branch office to what is in essence a home office. So if we take a look at that particular home office, what we see from our customers is frequently the endpoints within that VPN connection are frequently changing. Like I said to you before, I choose to use a home PC instead of one that's provided by my corporation, just purely because it has a bigger screen and I have a nicer environment to work in. So, and we see that very frequently. And when I use that, I actually make a direct connection up to all of the cloud services. So I'm actually, unless the only reference point at that point for my home PC connecting to that cloud infrastructure is my identity, which is typically managed through some, as I mentioned before, identity and access management control, or IAM, identity and access management solution. What's happened here, though, is interesting. Everyone in this situation is tending to increasingly use BYO devices, we hear from customers, whether it be because the device is superior to the one that they had provided by work, or because their employer was unable to even purchase laptops because of the lack of availability. There's a multitude of different scenarios, but we see these endpoints frequently becoming a different platform and not something that's managed by the corporation. As soon as that happens, you essentially lose almost, and these devices connect directly to the cloud, you essentially lose almost all of the perimeter-based security capabilities that you had. And to be honest, most of the customers that I speak to and the CISOs that I speak to, they're facing this type of environment today to work in. So, as I said at the beginning, how do you address security from endpoint to cloud in a scenario where the endpoints are completely heterogeneous, the network is not yours, and you still have to comply with corporate regulatory compliance issues, as well as protect your corporate data? So that's what we're going to talk about now. So we believe the right solution in this scenario is, firstly, to treat all of your applications like cloud applications. So we suggest that you essentially cloud enable all of your on-prem applications. Now, this is not something that's really that new. For those of us who've been around a long time, this is the whole progression of perimeterless technologies. I think the Jericho Forum originally referred to it, and then the zero trust thinking referred to it again. The idea is make all of your applications available over the internet, and then ensure that they're only connected to via trusted devices and trusted end users from an identity perspective. And that is what we're advocating. So by moving the cloud, the services that you had in the perimeter into the cloud, and in this case, we're showing the Lookout security graph as that cloud. All of your SaaS and on-prem but cloud-enabled applications would be connected to that cloud, and all of the services that you have in the perimeter would be provided in that cloud, and any device is then able to connect to it in any scenario. So let's dig into that a little bit. The first important emphasis that I'd make in this scenario is many of the tools that we see evolving in this market don't necessarily focus on enabling the best user experience. And quite frankly, most of them are relying on cloud deployment only, very limited client deployment, because that's an easier thing, arguably, to roll out. What we believe is that you'll gain the best user experience by actually deploying clients, and it gives you not only the better user experience for the end users, but also it gives you far more comprehensive assessment of the risk associated with those connections and those devices. So this is why we're advocating strongly for the integration of endpoint security along with cloud security, complete integration of that picture from endpoint to cloud, leveraging comprehensive analysis of the client with a better user experience, connecting through policy control into the cloud is the solution we're advocating. It enables zero trust access control effectively to replace that global policy level of control that you had prior to your perimeter disappearing. And I would argue that it actually brings to the table, at least in our solution, some advantages that weren't even available in the previous model. So what I mean by that is traditionally within the perimeter, access controls assumed that the device was safe. We now are able to make an assessment of whether that device is safe. Next, we typically did not analyze the context of the device, where it's physically located, what type of device is it, and so on. And we now have to do that in this new world where everyone's working from anywhere on any network. So we have far more data from that perspective. And then lastly, and this is quite unique to the Lookout solution, we're able to analyze whether the risk is elevated by the type of content the user is attempting to access. For example, it might be a low risk scenario if it is a salesperson attempting to download the latest presentation to engage with a customer. So you might allow that to occur on a device that you haven't recognized previously, or on a device that that is unmanaged and so on. Whereas if that salesperson is attempting to download all of your customer records and all of their purchasing history, then you might want to make sure that that device that is being used and that user is it's a managed device. It's in a configuration state that you're comfortable with, and the user has gone through probably two-factor at a minimum authentication in order to gain access to that content. With Lookout's solution, you're able to make sure that that's the case for all applications in all contexts. You're able also to monitor interaction with these cloud applications as well as the cloud-enabled on-prem applications to check for data loss. So, and not only do you have the ability to avoid data loss, you're able to also protect content in unique ways. So, say for example, if there is content that must, according to regulation, be encrypted in both in transit and at rest, and needs to be protected when it's downloaded on endpoints, depending on the collaboration tools and the way that users are accessing that content, that may or may not have happened in your traditional infrastructure. What you're able to do in this scenario is, no matter what data is being accessed, no matter how particular data is being accessed, you're able to impart that type of security on that data. Because all of the messaging and connection for these endpoints is running through this cloud, you're able to assess it from a phishing and content protection perspective, both from whether it's a malicious site or a drive-by download or some form of social engineering or phishing, or whether it's inappropriate content to coincide or work with your appropriate use guidelines. Because your productivity tools are also being accessed through this cloud, you're able to deliver the same level of email protection as you did previously with your perimeter, and you're able to support it now for any device, whether that device be managed or unmanaged on their own network or in any scenario ultimately. And you gain some additional insight into security and risk in this scenario. So because this system is aware both of the device and the user identity, as well as what the user is attempting to do for these managed SaaS applications and cloud-enabled on-prem applications and so on, you can detect anomalous user behavior. So a salesperson, for example, downloading the source code for a software company might be strange, or a salesperson in a particular region downloading all of the deal data for the global from global Salesforce, or any one of, and I don't mean to be picking on salespeople here, it could be, you know, the marketing person attempting to download a bunch of source code or intellectual property, things that are anomalous. You can now see and both monitor for and potentially react to, either through your SOC or through automated policy enforcement. It extends malware protection and threat coverage to everything that in the diagram, because everything is being monitored both from an endpoint and a transport perspective. And we're uniquely able to monitor most of this whilst respecting user privacy. Now, that's an optional capability in that companies can choose to deploy our capabilities with privacy controls turned on or turned off. So in a scenario where the entire connection from endpoint to cloud is all on managed devices under corporate governance and so on, it might be that full inspection is made on everything that is done in that connection. Alternatively, if it's a BYO device or a mobile device or a device and network that the employee expects some level of privacy on, we can implement that dependent on the scenario. So it's a very effective solution at respecting users' privacy, and where we are respecting privacy, we do the analysis and blocking and so on the endpoint without visibility to the administrators or the corporation. Therefore, very effectively respecting user privacy. So what I've described here gives you back that total control that you had, but in a completely heterogeneous environment. And we refer to that as the Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE solution from Lookout. Now, you're probably all familiar with the term SASE. It's a Gartner developed term, but the point here is essentially enabling all of the security capabilities that you had in your perimeter in this new perimeterless world. So our solution enables you to secure corporate data, probably the biggest challenge that you face, enables you to comply with regulations, and ultimately allows you to do all of that whilst ensuring user privacy. So with that, I want to say thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope we can see you soon. Bye.